how we serve God with all of our emotions, joy and anger and fear and the whole shebang. Today we're going to be talking about fear as well. The next week we'll be talking about how fear can separate us from other people, but today we're going to talk about what fear can do to us and to our relationship with God. You know, the opposite of faith, according to Jesus, is not doubt, but fear. Our story today from the Gospel of Matthew is a story of fear and faith. And it's so well known that probably even most non-Christians have heard of this story, at least in a basic sort of outline. This idea of Jesus walking on the water. It's even the basis for jokes that's entered into our popular culture. You know, you might look at somebody who thinks rather highly of themselves and say, oh, she must think she can walk on the water. It's entered into popular culture. It's understandable, because it's the kind of story that sticks with you, and whether you think it's just a story or whether you think it's something that actually happened, it's that kind of image that stays with you. You know, it's interesting that the basic version of this story, the part about Jesus walking across the Lake of Galilee to the disciples in the boat, appears in all three of the Gospels that are probably directly associated with the 12 apostles and their followers. And it makes sense to me because it's one of those stories that I think was so astounding that they had to be sure to get it down, that it was included, probably because it had made such an impression. Do you remember that time? Do you remember that night? I have never seen anything like that before, and I probably never will again. Do you remember that night when he was out there, walking on the water? An unforgettable story. One that the disciples of the disciples must have listened to with astonishment, and one that they just had to include in their written recollections of Jesus. And it's significant in all three of those Gospels that are so directly related to the apostles themselves, because it's kind of a turning point for them. It's kind of a proof of something about Jesus for them. There's kind of a shift in the way that they look at him. But you know, the interesting thing in the Gospel of Matthew is the thing that we sometimes overlook, that it was not only Jesus who was walking on the water. Because this is Peter's story too. And Peter's story, Peter's inclusion in this story, tells us something more. Something about human beings. And something about faith and fear. I want to take just a moment to talk about the placement of this story in the overall Gospel of Matthew, because it follows two major events, two really significant events: the death of John the Baptist and the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus and the 12 apostles had just received word about John's death, that he had been killed by King Herod. Now remember that it was John who had baptized Jesus, that it was John who had first introduced Jesus to many of his disciples. A number of those disciples had been disciples of John before they had left to follow Jesus. Jesus had spent time in that community with John before he began his own ministry. And John was their teacher, their friend, their leader. John was the disciples' master before they ever met Jesus. And this news must have been a shock to the entire group. John was dead. Think about that. You're part of this new movement, these two characters, John and Jesus, and you know that the authorities don't like you very much, but now one of them, John, is dead, beheaded. sitting there thinking, how long is it going to be until that starts to happen to Jesus? Until they start to look at the kind of things that Jesus is saying and start to get upset with him. And when that starts to happen, how long is it going to be until they start to look at Jesus' followers? If they had killed John, it must have been pretty clear to them that Jesus, and then even themselves, might be next. So when Jesus heard this news, and when the disciples heard this news, they wanted to get away. But a crowd had gathered around them, 5,000 people, the gospel tells us. The disciples of Jesus were reeling from this news about John. No wonder that the disciples said, send the crowd away, Jesus. Go and let them find dinner for themselves, because we need to process it. We need to talk about what's happened and figure out what we're going to do. But they were far from town. The crowd was hungry. Jesus and his followers were overwhelmed with this news, but they had people who needed to be fed. And Jesus looked at the disciples and he said to them, why don't you give them something to eat? And those disciples had hardly brought enough for themselves, 2 fish, 5 loaves. How could they feed a crowd of 5,000? But Jesus took that meager meal and blessed it. And the gospel tells us that those baskets just kept filling. They just kept filling and filling until everyone was fed, and there were 12 baskets left over. And while Jesus lingered with the crowd and talked to them, he sent those 12 original disciples across the lake in their boats. And then comes that unforgettable event, the story that we read today. You know, it might be easy for us in this rational age to dismiss these stories as purely allegorical. But what if they're not? What if these stories actually tell us something about faith and fear and human potential? Fear limits our ability to believe in possibilities. The lies that our fear tell us about ourselves sometimes limit what we think we can do. Now think about Peter for a moment. Peter was a man who knew the water. He knew that lake, and it's not a large lake. He knew that lake, no doubt, like the back of his hand. He knew the conditions of the water. He knew what would happen when the sky changed in a certain way, what to expect. He knew what would happen when the currents were going this way or that way. He knew that water and he knew that lake, and he knew every single possibility of being out of it. And then here comes Jesus, walking across the water. And maybe it was the shock of disbelief, or maybe it was something more. Maybe it was that sense that there is something else going on here. There's something more than what I know. Maybe it was a little bit of both. It caused Peter to set aside what he knew, to set aside his fears about stepping out in that stormy lake. It caused Peter to step out into faith. How many of you imagine that story in such a serene way? In such a serene way. You know, Jesus calling to Peter, and the lake suddenly calm. And Peter walking out like he's walking out on a red carpet or something towards Jesus on the water. But I don't believe that that's the way that it happened at all. I believe the waves were crashing, and Peter yells, "Is that you, Lord?" And Jesus yells back, "Come on, Peter!" And Peter half falls out of the boat, and the sea is rolling, and the waves are breaking up against his chest, and he's tossed, and he's turned, and he's twisted around, and he's thrashing in the storm, but he's on the water. That tells us something about fear fear and faith. It tells us that we cannot always set aside our fears in order to exercise our faith. That faith does not replace fear, but so often coexists with it. It teaches us about that experience of stepping out in faith. That even when our faith takes leaps and bounds, our fears can still be there, crashing around us. Because fear doesn't easily disappear. And that's why practicing faith in this world is such a courageous thing. Now, the story also teaches us something else about fear. It teaches us that fear can undermine the most remarkable act of faith. Sometimes we see this story kind of like a test, that Jesus believed that Peter couldn't really walk, and he just wanted to sort of put him through a bit of a test, sort of demonstrate something. I don't think that's the case. I think when Jesus said, "Come out of that boat and walk over here, Peter," he believed wholeheartedly that Peter could do that. And for a moment, so did Peter. This story teaches us that Jesus believes in us. It's not just about believing in Jesus, but it's what Jesus believes in us, if only we could grasp our full potential. You know, Jesus tells us again and again in Scripture that we can have faith, that we can have faith like He has faith, that we can call on the same God and do the same things that Jesus does. All of that is our inheritance as daughters and sons of God, if only we could push through our doubt and our fear. There are other lies that our fear tells us. There are lies that are told to us about ourselves, about what we are capable of, that we couldn't possibly, that we can't, that we shouldn't. Sometimes our fears tell us different kind of lies. They tell us that we're right and that everyone else is wrong. Our fears speak to us in so many ways that limit us as people. But the biggest way that our fear speaks to us is in the way that limits us as people of God. We might think that Jesus was rebuking Peter when he said, "You of little faith," but I don't think he was. I think it was more like a sad reflection. Why so little faith? Why did you doubt? If only you could all grasp what you are capable of. If only you could all grasp what would happen if you unleashed the Spirit of God that is within you. Why so little faith? Why did you doubt? Our fears limit our potential by telling us lies. By telling us that we are not children of God. That we were not created in God's image. That we were not created with capacities for vast spiritual living. Our fears tell us that all we have is what we have right here and right now. Our fears tell us that we need to fear God, the one who made us. And all of these things limit us and make us less than what we could be. In the largest way of all, our fears deny that we are made in that image of God, that we are loved and not judged, that we are embraced and not disgraced. Our fears tell us that we are not imbued with infinite possibilities and potential, when that is what God tells us again and again in page after page of the Bible. You are my daughters you are my sons. Come and claim your inheritance. Our fears have brought about our fall, if you want to think of it in that way. Our fears keep us from what God would have for us. Can we set aside our fears? Well, we know that at least some of us can sometimes. And yes, maybe for a little while, and maybe we start to sink in those waves again. But at least we walk on the water for a while. Set aside your fears, O people, and walk with me in all